Hello again, and welcome to the third segment of this week's presentation for Politics of Southeast Europe on political and social processes in post-conflict environments. And in this segment, I want to talk about denial and to try to give you a picture of the complexity of denial. So let me try to put this in context. And I'd say as there is a tendency to look at the processes of post-conflict justice and reconciliation as having mostly failed. And the reason that people tend to make this assessment is that you can see now, many years after the end of the conflict, the continued use of rhetorical positions and orientations from the period of the conflict, the persistence in political power of parties and in some cases individuals who were involved in the conflict and in the commission of crimes, so the persistence of political power of the war parties, and the lack of response that is visible in societies to findings and decisions of courts, tribunals, and of other revelations of fact on the level of society, politics, and culture. And so there is a tendency to talk about denial, and denial is apparent in the official policies of states and materials like school history textbooks, media, and so on. But I want to talk about denial. Denial is something more than simple denial of facts. It's more than simply saying that something didn't happen. Denial of facts is probably the least interesting type of denial. Instead, what does is it responds to findings of fact by changing standards, by postulating changed context. That is to say, it is a process that is flexible, it's dynamic, it's creative, and stories and understandings change through denial. So the basic message about denial is that denial is not simple. And one of the ways that we can look at this is by talking about recognition and responsibility and denial as existing on a continuum. Um, so people have postulated 12-step programs. I have here what might be thought of as an 11-step program. These aren't really steps. What this is a typology of kinds of denial. And the first two are the kinds that might be most familiar, but also the least interesting. One of them is denial through affirmation, that is, saying that crimes were committed, but they were committed for a good reason, that they ought to be celebrated, that they were a part of a national political program that was legitimate, or that they were necessary in order to prevent crimes being committed by the other side. This is not difficult to understand, and we'll move on to it. The second kind of denial is what's most frequently referred to as denial. That is the statement that something didn't happen, or that something is not important, or that we don't want to talk about it. This, again, I think, does not require a lot of explanation. What I would say is we're likely to see more of this in the early stages of denial than we see in later stages. And so I want to talk about some of the more subtle forms of denial that develop as the process of denial becomes more complex over time. The first of these, listed as number 3 here on the list, is what we call the ideology of forgetting. That is the idea that anything that happened in the past. We are concerned about the future. What we need to do is to forgive, forget, and move on. Now, there's a lot that can be said about the ideology of forgetting. One thing that we can say is that the invitation to forgive and forget is an invitation that is more often made by representatives of perpetrators than by representatives of victims. The fourth type that I want to look at is transference as avoidance. And that is the argument that the crimes that were committed by a small and identifiable number of people who have nothing to do with the person who is speaking or with legitimate state institutions, or with the obligations of the state. So to say that crimes have nothing to do with me as a person or with the society that I'm living in. So this type of denial seeks to transfer the blame onto a group that is not associated either with the speaker or with anybody whom the speaker is addressing. The fifth type of denial is denial through apology. That is the belief that all responsibility and all obligations can be annulled by offering an apology. The sixth type I have is here a Latin phrase. This is a phrase taken from law, but in Latin, tu quoque literally means you too, and that is the argument that crimes may have been committed by the group that is represented by the speaker, but crimes were also committed by other people. By the other side, or you could say historically have been committed in other conflicts and consequently are less important. Now, in law, a tu quoque argument will always be rejected by a court, because then what it is asking the judges to do is to consider a fact that is not at stake. As a matter of logic, and could probably say as a matter of morality, it is also an invalid argument, but it's one that is raised frequently. That is the contention that all sides are guilty or all are equally guilty, and therefore the guilt of one side annuls the guilt of another. The seventh type of denial is broadening the context of the violation that is being discussed, so that the violation becomes unimportant. This is a case in which, for example, where people talk about the genocide in Srebrenica, which had about 8,300 victims, saying that is fewer than the number of victims of the Armenian genocide, or the genocide in Rwanda, or the genocides that occurred during the Second World War, or all of the genocides that occurred in all of the conflicts between every group that ever existed in human history. That is to say, this is an attempt to dilute crimes by postulating that crimes are a universal fact, and that no one crime or that no one violation creates a particular kind of obligation. Moving back to denial of facts, and this is what the eighth and ninth types of denial relate to. One is the general position that not everything is known, that is contestation of evidence based upon a kind of very detailed re-examination of all sources of evidence, raising bits of doubt here and there, and making the argument that what is established as a fact is really not a fact. And this sounds like a sneaky rhetorical move that's easily identified, but it is in fact the mission of groups like, for example, the so-called Srebrenica Research Group, which is a group financed by the government of Republika Srpska, one of the entities in Bosnia and Herzegovina, to try to deny one by one findings, forensic findings, and other findings related to the creation of victims in the Srebrenica genocide. And what the argument amounts to eventually is the argument that it is impossible to establish truth as a matter of principle, and therefore truth cannot be established in the set of events that are under consideration. Similarly, with the ninth type, this is a type of denial that derives its force from questioning the legitimacy and credibility of states and institutions and people revealing facts and making accusations. The import of this is probably obvious enough. And then finally, having talked about types of denial, I want to talk about types of affirmation. First, backward-looking affirmation. This is the approach that argues, yes, we do recognize everything that's been done. We feel responsible for it or guilty about it, and we should feel guilty about it. And the guilt that we have will become a constitutive part of our identity. This is the approach that has been developed in a large scale, for example, in post-World War II Germany in relation to crimes committed as a part of the genocides that were simultaneous with the Second World War, in which every child is required to learn about the events, to accept a form of responsibility for it. What you could argue about backward-looking responsibility is that although it's better than denial, it's difficult to see many concrete contributions toward the building of the future that's postulated under terms like reconciliation. Its primary effect appears to be to compel people to feel bad about themselves, and we can't be certain about where this leads. And finally, I want to look at forward responsibility, that is, the contention that a detailed and balanced and open understanding of the past functions as a source of obligation toward the future, in which commitments of members of the group and between members of the group and people outside the group are affirmed by the recognition of fact and the assumption of responsibility. This is the rarest form. It's hard to identify many cases in which states or societies have reached this condition, but probably the one that is most productive of what might be thought of sometimes as the impossible expectations that are attached to post-conflict processes. I'll end by making a final point about denial, and that is the difference between denial as the stubbornness of individuals or the intransigence of some state institutions. And what makes the difference between a sort of counterfactual stance and denial as a political force is whether the institutions in a society that are most trusted, and these are for the most part, they partly involve political institutions, but for the most part, they involve either pre-political institutions, like religious institutions and in some cases military institutions, or they involve extra-political institutions which derive their authority from their ability to communicate with the public, and these include institutions like the arts, culture, education, and so on. It's whether these institutions are involved with seeking and communicating and building on historical fact and the obligations that derive from historical fact. Now, they can be negatively engaged. They can be part of the process of denial. They can be positively engaged. That is, they can be trying to promote consciousness and a sense of obligation. And what happens most often, at least in the states that we're looking at, is that they are disengaged. That is, that the state is left as the principal actor, and the state, in the absence of political will, does very little with its obligations as a principal actor.